We are at the appointed hour, I think very timely. My watch is a little bit late, so I think I'm in good time. Hello and welcome to this important Sustainable Population Australia public forum entitled From Housing Crisis to Eco-Crisis, Why Australia's Population Growth is Unsustainable. I'm Peter Strachan and I'm delighted to be the newly installed president of this environmental organisation. Before we commence formal presentations today, let me acknowledge the Gooniyja people as the custodians of the land and waters of Adelaide region on which we meet today, and we pay respects to their elders both past and present. We acknowledge and respect the Gooniyja people's cultural, spiritual, physical and emotional connection to their land, waters and community. At this forum, it is of particular importance to remind ourselves that First Nations people who travelled to this continent over a long period, at least 60,000 years ago, are recognised to have maintained their numbers sustainably below 1 million people with little impact on the country's ability to sustain life. This should be a guiding principle and a lesson to us here today, since their record stands in stark contrast to the damage that has been done to Australia's biophysical environment over the past 236 years. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respects to my elders and forebears who arrived 3 or 4 generations ago when Australia supported less than 3 million people, since they were the people who have supported me through my journey. So today we're privileged to welcome 2 of the most exciting speakers in Australia to discuss our twin ecological and housing crisis. But first, let me introduce Sustainable Population Australia to those who may be less familiar, and I've spoken to a few people here today, while also reminding those who are just what we stand for. Sustainable Population Australia takes the position that there is a fundamental conflict between population growth and environmental protection, a sustainable economy and the health and well-being of our people, everyone. While SPA rejects wasteful overconsumption, we do believe that all Australians deserve at least a modest, comfortable lifestyle. But we recognise that this comes with an ecological price tag, which limits the numbers who can sustainably support without degradation of our resources and ecosystems. Australia now exceeded those numbers with 27 million. In the best interests of our land and people, the Sustainable Population Australia position calls for a stabilised Australian population maintained safely within ecological limits. Sustainable Population Australia strongly and unequivocally denounces racism. Our population position is purely about numbers and lifestyles and how they combine to impact our long-term ecological responsibilities. However, SPA believes Australia should lead by example on the global stage, being generous in its assistance to those in need, both financially and through our sharing of knowledge. Survey after survey over decades finds that while Australians are generally welcoming of immigrants, around 70% of us say no to the big Australia. Back in 1974, when Australia's population was 12.7 million, when expressing his view that the quality of transport, schools, housing and other services would increase for Australians, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam said, and I quote, "I do not envisage any dramatic increase in our present population and I would not wish to see one." Now we have 27 million. Fast forward 20 years and the former Prime Minister Bob Hawke made the remarkably frank admission that immigration policy had effectively been a conspiracy by the political establishment against the Australian public. Hawke agreed that most voters wanted immigration reduced, saying that there had been, quote, "an implicit pact between the major parties to implement broad policies on immigration that they knew were not generally endorsed by the electorate," end of quote. Now, in order to demonstrate public support, Sustainable Population Australia has embarked on a campaign to attract signatures to our petition in support of its position statement. which I've just read out. This Say No to the Big Australia campaign aims to encourage people to take a simple step of signing our position statement, signing the petition, and using a web-based application provided on the site to send a prepaid letter of concern capable of being edited as desired to their federal parliamentarian, outlining the issues that overpopulation presents. All up, this process takes about 2 minutes. I did it. I made some edits to the page, as is my want, and it was all done in less than 2 minutes. In this way, sustainable population will be able to demonstrate widely held community support held by SPA to decision makers as it seeks to lobby for positive change. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Jane O'Sullivan, our first speaker. Jane is a cross-disciplinary researcher spanning the nexus between agriculture and demography, embracing food security, ecological sustainability, and economic development. She has led international research in tropical research and semi-subsistence crops and farming systems before shifting her focus to the threats posed by population growth to food security, economic development, and ecological sustainability, and the effectiveness of measures available to limit population. Many of Jane's presentations at various fora can be found on our website, population.org.au, covering topics from ecological economics, environmental philosophy, climate change responses, and family planning, promotion, and implementation. She is a co-convener of the Overpopulation Project, which is, I encourage you to go to on the web, with many publications to her name. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I'm going to talk today about the immigration that Australia has been experiencing and what sustainable immigration would look like. And this chart is showing Australia's net overseas migration since 1982, which is where the ABS's series of data begins. And you can see that for a couple of decades, it was tracking it in the 90,000s per year, up to about 2005, when there was a big jump in immigration up to the 220,000s per year on average. And you might remember the Howard government pushing both the baby bonus, have one for mum, one for dad, and one for the country, as well as rapidly increasing immigration while distracting the public by being tough on refugees. So while they were being tough about the few thousand people coming here by boat, there were hundreds of thousands of people coming here by aeroplane and welcomed into our workforce. So then along came COVID, and you can see the huge dip in net migration into the negative territory as a lot of temporary migrants had to leave because their jobs were shut down and they didn't have any welfare to fall back on. And so in the post-COVID period, we've got this huge increase to utterly unprecedented levels of immigration that we're currently in now. And the government is saying, well, this is just rebound from the COVID and we still have less people in Australia than we would have if COVID hadn't happened. Now, this is, as of last September, a lie, because we have now overtaken where we would have been without COVID. So this is the cumulative net migration since that change in policy around 2005, how many migrants we've added to the country, and we're now about 4 million. The dotted line here is what would have happened without COVID, and we're now well above that with no sign that we're going to reduce the rate of net migration in order to get back to anything that was pre-COVID. Now, a lot of people hear that, you know, population's growing at 1.5% per year or 2% per year. In the year to September, it actually grew at 2.5% over that year. And what people don't realise is what that means in terms of the population growth over decades. And at 2%, that means a doubling time every 35 years, which means by the end of this century, we'd have over 100 million people in Australia. By the end of the next century, we'd have nearly 1 billion people on this dry continent. Now, Australia is a lucky country in that we produce a lot more food than we need to eat. It's a major exporter of food to all the countries, the many countries who can't feed their own population. And we feed about 60 million people. But, you know, we've already gone from exporting 2/3 of that to exporting barely a half of it. And we could become food insecure within about 40 years if we didn't stabilise our population. In a drought year, our wheat crop is about halved, so we only really feed 30 million people. Well, we'll be there in a handful of years to the situation where a severe drought would mean that we have to buy wheat on the international market. In those years when the price is the highest that it reaches. So don't forget, the rate of growth means we're rapidly heading towards that situation of insecurity. But of course, if you want to talk about this, there's always a lot of pushback from the people who say it's racist, you're just blaming population growth instead of the consumption behaviours, and there's always an implication that therefore, you know, you're in favour of profligate, wasteful consumption because you want to just blame population growth. It's always about, you know, you're trying to stop people have babies. You want a Chinese-style one-child policy and control women's bodies. And why don't you kill yourself first? We've all heard these stories. It's not about being pro-migrant or anti-migrant. It's about numbers. And when people respond to me, you know, saying it's shameful to be anti-migrant, I say, well, what level of immigration do you think is appropriate for Australia? And if they want open borders, just remember that Gallup polls, which is the international survey company, they do surveys of people's intentions to migrate on a regular basis. And in 2021, 900 million people in the world wanted to emigrate from the country they're in to a richer country. 36 million of them, about 4% of them, nominated Australia as their preferred destination. So open borders means that all of those people would arrive as soon as they could arrange it. And probably quite a few of these people would as well, because we're the ones with the open door and the place they'd rather go to isn't accepting them. So obviously we couldn't cope with that. So immigration policy is about who you say no to and under what criteria. And Australia doesn't even pretend that we have immigration for the sake of the migrants. We are quite open about selecting migrants that we believe will be an advantage to Australia. So what we're really arguing about is this is the quantity of migrants that we had in the years to September, but by far the biggest intake we have ever had. At this level, we're saying no to all these people and all these people. You know, so is there an ethical difference between this and the 235,000 that Treasury is projecting into the future as our stable, supposedly sustainable immigration level, or what Sustainable Population Australia is advocating, around 60 to 70,000 as a sustainable level of net immigration? There's really no ethical difference between who you say no to at those levels. But there is a big difference in the impact we have on the ability of the world to stabilise. So we are not going to solve the world's overpopulation problem by being the release valve for those overcrowded countries to send their people here. And on the contrary, we make it harder for world population to stabilise by having this story that our economy depends on population growth, and migrants are good for us and for our economy. That story is based on a bunch of myths, which I won't get into a whole lot, but I will touch on. But the effect of those myths is that all these developed countries are so scared of an aging population and running out of workers that they not only don't put the resources into family planning and allowing women to control their fertility when they want to, they actively withdraw women's access to contraception and to abortion in order to coerce those women to have children they don't want, in order to boost their population and make sure they've got enough young people coming on stream. And that is happening around the world as we speak. A number of countries have put in pronatalist policies that are actually undermining women's rights. And it is a myth that we need more workers. And I've looked at all of the OECD countries and what's happened to their workforce as their population has aged. Japan, for instance, has twice the proportion of people over 65 as Australia, and has pretty much exactly the same proportion as Australia of people who have jobs. So there's been no shrinkage of workforce at all in any of these countries that are much more advanced in the ageing process than Australia. What happens is that the labour market tightens, which means there's less unemployment. The people who find it difficult to get work now because they're a bit disabled, or they're, over 55, or for whatever reason employers are reluctant to employ them, they start to get jobs. It's much more inclusive. It's also the case that the rate of population growth generates labour shortages. The skills shortages that we hear about in the media are vastly exaggerated. What's happening is that employers have been spoilt by having easy access to migrant workers, and they are not willing to train workers for the roles that they have. So we have record numbers of Australian graduates who can't get work in the area that they've trained in. They have to pay the HECS debt, but they don't get the income that they were expecting to have on account of that degrees. And the Productivity Commission has looked into this quite a bit, and young graduates in the last 10 years have got lower grade jobs and slower career progressions than graduates did 20 or 30 years ago. Because our labour market is oversupplied, it's not undersupplied. The high rate of population growth generates skills shortages because we have to build all this extra infrastructure, and it takes a lot of labour to build that stuff. And we have to train all these extra young people entering the workforce, because you get this pyramid of age in the workforce where there's a lot more young people at the bottom who have to be trained in order to grow the workforce in the future. So the more people we have, the more skills shortages we have. And the best way to address skills shortages is to slow the population growth rate down. So if you look across all countries in the world, there's a data point for every 5-year period between 1960 and 2010, and look at how population growth rate relates to the change in GDP per capita over that 5-year period. The faster they grow, the less GDP per capita increase. They're growing at more than 2% per annum. There's virtually no increase in GDP per capita, because so much of what the economy has to do is just running in order to stand still, just building enough extra stuff to cater for the extra people. And it is such a huge burden on the economy that those countries can't get richer. They just can't build enough housing to get people out of poor, slums and things. They can't build enough schools to improve education. It just is an impossible situation. So it's like trying to run up a down escalator. So the down escalator is a population growth throwing the need to build more stuff all the time. And the slower you go, the slower the population growth, for the same amount of effort, the more easily you can get ahead. And once the escalator's stopped, you start to get ahead. And every country that has stabilised its population is advancing economically. Population growth is not good for the economy. It's absolutely not good for the environment. And time after time, the Australia State of the Environment report has declared this very clearly. This is from the 2021 State of the Environment report that says population growth contributes to all of the pressures described in this report. Each person added to our population increases demand on our natural resources to provide food, shelter, and materials for living. This is stating the obvious, but, you know, the government really doesn't care about the environmental outcomes, even though our quality of life ultimately depends on it. So what is a sustainable level of migration? And nothing can grow forever. So to be sustainable, the migration level has to allow our population to stabilise. And so that depends on the size of our families, our average fertility. Because if the average Australian couple was having two children each, then those two children would replace their parents and there would be a stable population with no migration at all. But if they were to have an average of one child each, which is very low fertility, but it exists in Hong Kong and South Korea and places like that, then for each child born in Australia, there would be a place for a migrant without increasing the population. So the migrant would take the place of below replacement childbearing. If we have about 1.66 children per woman, that's a third of a child per woman short of replacement. Then for every 3 families in Australia, there would be place for 1 migrant. If we drop it down to 1.5, then for every 2 families in Australia, there'd be a place for 1 migrant. So effectively that's, you know, for every 3 children born in Australia, there'd be a place for 1 migrant. So what this means in terms of numbers, the numbers decrease from 0 if we have replacement fertility to around 170,000 per year if we have only 1 child per woman. So for the sort of fertility rates that we've been having, it's around 1.7 children per woman, the sustainable norm would be about 60,000. Actually, right at the moment, the latest data is that we're around 1.6. So sustainable norm's a bit more than 70,000. So if we're thinking in that 60, 70,000 bracket, that's what a sustainable level of immigration would be. That's net. So net migration is the number of long-term arrivals minus the number of long-term departures. And every year, quite a few Australians emigrate to other countries to work, and quite a lot of them come back eventually. So on a net basis, we get about 20,000 more emigrating than repatriating Australians. So we could have an extra 80,000 or so people born in other countries coming to Australia per year on a sustainable basis, and it would eventually, our growth would taper off fairly quickly at around 30 million. What we need to understand is that the story we've been getting from the Albanese government is that what they're about is giving pathways to permanent migration. They don't want migrants to be left in limbo. They don't want migrants to be exploited in the workforce. They want to be able to get the maximum potential out of each migrant. So we want migrants to be working in the area that they're trained in. And we don't want engineers driving Ubers because, you know, we're importing them as skilled migrants, but they're not doing that work. And what we're saying is that actually lower, not higher immigration is going to achieve all those things, because a tighter labour market means that there are jobs for those people to do in the area they're trained in. The way to improve pathways to permanence, you need 2 things. You need to reduce the inflow of temporary migrants, and you have to stop giving the permanent visas, for which there are a quota, so there's a limited number. Stop giving them to people who haven't even come here yet. give them to the temporary migrants when they've established themselves and shown that they can find work in their relevant area, and stop giving them to people we haven't even met yet and don't have jobs. So all skilled migrants should be initially temporary and employer sponsored. We shouldn't let them stay here unless they've got a job to come to. That's why we call them skilled migrants, but we're bringing them here by ticking the box to see what score they get rather than whether or not an employer actually wants to employ them. And then finally, temporary categories need to be capped. So we can't have a completely uncapped number of international students swamping our tertiary education system, and then all trying to stay in Australia on graduate visas and bridging visas and another student visa to try and extend their stay in Australia. If there are fewer of them, then there's fewer that will be disappointed when they can't get a permanent visa. So temporary migrants are like, the bathtub that depends on the level of water in the bathtub depends on the rate at which it's going in compared with the rate at which it flows out, either into the permanent migrant pool or repatriated going home. Claire O'Neill, our immigration minister, says too many migrants are stuck in permanently temporary limbo. And then she opens the spigot to bring more in. So this is kind of a list of most of the things that the Albanese government has done that effectively increase the number of migrants arriving in Australia. They increased the permanent quota initially by 35,000, but then they've reduced it to 30,000 more than before. So it's 190,000 now. At the same time, they increased the refugee quota from 13,750 up to 20,000. They vastly expanded the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, which is the agricultural workers who come to the country. They can now stay for 4 years, and there used to be under 6,000 of them. There are now something like 27,000 of them. And they've introduced the Pacific Engagement Visas, which basically allow 3,000 a year of those temporary low-skilled workers to stay permanently on a lottery basis. So what that means is it's not really picking the best of them, but it's making it much more attractive for people to come and do that dirty work for a few years in the hope of getting a permanent visa. So we're starting to poach teachers and nurses from Vanuatu to come and pick fruit here for a few years in the hope that they're going to be able to get a permanent visa and then bring their families. New Zealand residents can now apply for citizenship. So New Zealand residents are allowed to live in Australia and work, and we're allowed to live in New Zealand and work. But in order to get permanent residence and citizenship, they had to apply for a permanent resident visa. Now they can just, if they've been here for a number of years, they can apply for citizenship directly. And what difference did that make? They were here anyway. Well, the difference it makes is that 8,000 to 10,000 of them who were applying for permanent visas every year and taking those visas out of the quota now don't have to. So there's 8,000 to 10,000 extra permanent visas within the quota to go to other migrants. The India Free Trade Agreement, we haven't really seen the impacts of this yet because their labour mobility capacity hasn't been actually activated yet, but that's going to mean longer graduate visas for Indians and easier access to our workforce for a number of professions. They expanded the number of regional and state-sponsored skilled migration visas, and these we know are migrants with low employment outcomes, and they tend not to stay in the regions that have sponsored them. Extended working holiday visas and the aged care labour agreement, which is bringing in relatively low paid workers to work in aged care. So these are all things that they've done that increase immigration. More recently, there have been a few measures that have been taken to reduce immigration, including raising the skilled migrant income threshold to 70,000 a year. Now that's still below the median full-time income in Australia. And this is meant to apply to graduates in professional jobs. So it's still a pretty low bar, but it's significantly higher than the deplorably low level that it was before. And they've raised the bar on some student visas to make sure that students are actually coming here to study and not just to enrol in some dodgy college that doesn't really have any teaching and go out to work full time. And they've stopped students just rolling onto another student visa in order to stay in Australia and work. Those are all good things, but they're still uncapped programs. There's still no limit on the number of temporary skilled migrants and student visas. They've stopped the investor golden ticket. If you've got $5 million or whatever it was, you could just come here and be a permanent resident. So they've ended that one, but that's only been ever a couple of thousand a year. And they've sped up the processing of asylum seekers, which is a good thing for real refugees, but it's also a good thing because a lot of people were coming here in order to work, but they just arrive on a visitor visa and then they'd apply for asylum and know that they would then be given a bridging visa that would allow them to work, and it would take at least 6 years for Australia to decide to kick them out. So if that's processed faster, then we get to kick them out sooner. And then there's a proposed bill to make it easier to actually make them go home. But for all of this, the changes that have increased migration so much, what we're hearing from our politicians is this sophistry around the fact that, oh, no, there's nothing to see here. We're not trying to increase migration. It's not about the numbers, and we really believe in, jobs for Australians first. But we know that Australians, when asked, don't want Australia to have a bigger population. And this was from the Australian Population Research Institute survey of 2019, but actually is the one that just published the last couple of weeks came up with much the same result. The total 71% of the population doesn't want Australia to have a bigger population. And it's a majority in every political party. But we know that there are some powerful vested interests who benefit from population growth. They include the property industry, and the housing crisis that we're really focusing on at the moment is very much to the benefit of the property industry. The big business lobby wants cheap labour and more customers. And the university vice-chancellors want open slather on as many temporary student migrants as they can get in through the doors. And the migration agents, that's a huge multi-million-dollar industry of these people who are really exploiting vulnerable temporary migrants in the hope that they can stay permanently, and just creating a bigger mess. So all of these people have a disproportionate influence on immigration policy. But we don't get an honest conversation about this at any level. People say, well, it's all about the planning. We just have to plan better. So this is South East Queensland's recent update of their regional plan. And it says SEQ will have reduced greenhouse gas emissions and be more resilient to the projected effects of climate change. SEQ will be carbon neutral and have net zero waste. And the region's food, water and energy supplies systems will be flexible, reliable and secure. Meanwhile, we'll double the population. Does anyone believe this stuff? Well, apparently they do. So it's a case of complacent optimism that people just believe that things will work out all right in the end. Will we act before it's too late? Well, not if we don't get up and say what we want. So I'll just finish by giving a plug to SPA's discussion papers that go into a lot of these issues in more detail. There's a couple of them available at the front table there, and that's it from me.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. I'm sorry about the technical issues there. Now, in the interest of time, I think we'll move on because we did have that little hiccup where we were missing slides on Zoom. And I'd like to introduce Leith van Onselen, and thank you to Jane for your great talk here today. Now, Leith van Onselen is an economist who has survived working for both the state and federal Treasury departments in Australia, kept his sanity through all of that. And then he also jumped to the dark side and worked in capital markets area for several years with Goldman Sachs, aka Sachs of Gold. Now, Leith has a Bachelor of Commerce with honours degrees from my old university, the University of Melbourne. And like me, he holds a graduate diploma of Applied Finance and Investment from the Securities Institute of Australia. He's a prolific writer and social commentator and co-founder of social and economics analysis provider MacroBusiness.com.au, where I've been a subscriber almost since day one. So thank you to Leith.
Thanks very much, Peter. Look, it's great to be following Jane. Jane's a bit of a legend in this space, and I think we worked on a paper a few years back. It's great to actually meet in the flesh. And it's great to be in Adelaide. This is my favourite city in Australia, actually. I'm a Melburnian. It might shock you for me to say that, but I used to come here every year to visit my wife's grandparents, and unfortunately they passed, so I don't come here anymore, but it's a great city. It almost reminds me of a sort of smaller Melbourne without the traffic and all the good parts of Melbourne without the bad. And better weather as well. The title of the speech is Immigration and the Everything Shortage. So basically what it's about is it's about immigration and the impact on your quality of life effectively. So as Jane mentioned, Australia has ramped up its immigration intake massively since the mid-2000s. We'll have some charts to quickly run past. My presentation doesn't have a whole lot of overlap with Jane's, which is good. I was a bit worried whenever you do these things and I haven't seen what she was going to do. I didn't want it to be too much overlap. Basically, yeah, so it's an analysis, a visual analysis and a statistical analysis. I won't try and make it too boring. Basically, of how immigration is impacting all the areas that impact your quality of life. Credit to Microsoft Copilot for that picture. If you ever need to make great graphics, just go into Copilot. It's fantastic. Okay, so I'm just going to gloss over this part because Jane's already covered it. This chart on the left-hand side is effectively, this is Australia's immigration going all the way back to federation. So back when Australia was federated. And this is the level of immigration we had in the 60 years post the Second World War, where we averaged 90,000 a year. That there is what I call sustainable level immigration. It worked beautifully for the nation for 60 years. And obviously from 2005, it shot up 220,000 a year for 15 years leading up to the pandemic. And then it shot up again. I won't go into too much there because Jane's already covered it. On the right-hand side here, we have Australia's permanent migrant intake. Now, the Albanese government, when it came into office in December 2021 and January 2022, was quoted in the mainstream media. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said he was going to run a lower migration program. As Jane's just expertly explained, as soon as he got in, held the Jobs and Skills Summit in September 2022, used it as a Trojan horse to ramp immigration. Obviously, he ramped the permanent migrant intake to around 215,000, if you count the humanitarians, which is the highest level ever as well. He also ramped the temporaries to record levels, record temporary migration. So we have three charts here basically showing what this great government of ours has done on the temporary side. So they promised to basically shift the migration intake away from temporaries onto permanents. Instead, we've had record temporary visa holders. So February data from the Department of Home Affairs showed we had 2.4 million temporary migrants in the country. That's if you exclude visitors. That's up 400,000 from the pre-pandemic peak. We've got 713,000 international students in the country currently. That's up about 100,000 from the pre-pandemic peak. Data released this week by the monthly permanent long-term arrivals data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics showed that we had a record 105,000 net permanent long-term arrivals arrive in February alone, about 170 odd over the quarter. And we had record monthly, quarterly and annual net permanent long-term arrivals. So this record net overseas migration we got in the year to September of just under 550,000 looks like it's continued into the new year. It's still running at roughly that level. It's absolutely bananas. So Albo has delivered us both record permanent and temporary migration. Now, this is something which I hear this often in the press, and it sort of irritates me a little bit. You hear people say, look, 60% of Australia's population growth comes from immigration. You hear it all the time. It's actually false. It's 100%. And the reason for that is migrants have children, right? So I've done a chart here. This is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics' latest population forecasts, and it effectively shows what Australia's population growth will be by 2071. It pretty much marries with the intergeneration report under current settings or under their projected settings versus our population growth with zero net overseas migration. Now, I'm actually not a supporter of zero net overseas migration. I think we should have a bit, but this is just basically to show that by 2071, according to the ABS, we'd actually have have 1 million less people in Australia with zero net overseas migration. So it's just to basically prove the point that 100% all of Australia's population growth comes from immigration, net overseas migration. It's not 60% as they claim. On the right here, we've got the capital city population projections based on the ABS's latest data. So this black line here is Australia's population in 1950. We had around 8 million-ish. Sydney by 2071 is supposed to be at about that level, about the 1950 for the whole country level. Melbourne is going to be, getting towards 10 million people by 2071. Brisbane, about 4.5. Adelaide, Perth, 1.4, and Adelaide, about 2 million people. So I thought I'd put Adelaide in there because I'm obviously presenting Adelaide, but you guys aren't going to cop it nearly as bad as what us poor suffering Melburnians are going to cop it. Now, we all know, we all read about it. There's shortages and everything, right? We've got the everything shortage. That's the whole title of this speech. We've got shortages in hospitals, not enough hospital beds. We've got traffic congestion. We've got shortages of schools, not enough school places, not enough rental accommodation, et cetera, et cetera. The scary thing about this is that this was explicitly forecast by Infrastructure Australia just before COVID. So in 2018, Infrastructure Australia modelled what the livability would be like in Sydney and Melbourne under 3 development scenarios. So one, which they called expanded low density, which is actually high density. They forecast that 70% of Sydney's future housing would be high rise and 60% in Melbourne. The rest has been sort of low density. So, sorry, I shouldn't say high rise, in existing areas. Medium, 80% Sydney, 70% Melbourne would be in established areas, and under their so-called centralised high density, which is basically Hong Kong, you'd have 90% of new homes would be within the existing urban footprint and 80% in Melbourne. And what it showed, no matter which development scenarios Melbourne and Sydney undertook, you'd have worse livability indicators in everything, every single thing. Traffic congestion, how long it takes to get to work, access to jobs, access to hospitals, access to schools, access to green space. Every single one of those would be worse by 2046, which is its model scenario, versus its reference case, which is 2016, based on the 2016 census. So under their own modelling, your living standards would get worse under the current population policy. All right, so I'm just going to quickly touch on these areas before I get into the big one, which is housing, which I'm sure a lot of you want to talk about. So who would have thought, shock horror, traffic, the amount of traffic on your roads is directly proportional to population growth? You wouldn't think it, would you? Oh no, terrible. So here's a chart from the Bureau of Transport and Regional Economics. It's a couple of years old, shows that, cars on the road matches population growth. Same with freight. So this is the same bureau. And this was actually the latest data on vehicle registrations. Got this from the ABS. And basically, surprise, surprise, in the last 2 years, the amount of cars on the road have basically grown with population growth, almost perfectly correlated. Who would have thunk it, eh? This is the big one. So data released this week, would you believe, by the Australian Medical Association, showed that on all metrics, shortages in hospitals are getting worse and worse. The proportion of emergency department patients seen on time is down sharply over the past several decades. The median time for an elective surgery has shot up. The percentage of emergency department visits completed in 4 hours or less is down sharply. All this is directly related to population growth. Now, obviously, some of this stuff is labour related, right? So if you import a whole bunch of nurses, et cetera, that can help with hospital shortages, although it creates shortages elsewhere. but also it's just physical. We just literally don't have enough hospitals to keep up with population growth. Same with water. This chart's from Infrastructure Australia from a couple of years ago, and it basically modelled the real cost. This is the real cost of water for households over up to 2067. What it basically showed is we'll have almost a 5-fold increase in your water bills over the next, well, it was basically 50 years when they did the modelling. And the reason for that is because we are structurally short of water in Australia. And if you're going to keep growing the population like a lab experiment, you're going to need to build a battery desalination plants everywhere to get that water. And desalination is way more expensive than traditional water supplies. And what that means is you end up paying more for your water. We've got schools. So this is a 2016 report from the Grattan Institute. And what they modelled back then was that 2026, they're only 2 years away from this modelling, Australia needed 400 to 750 new schools to accommodate an extra 650,000 students because of population growth. I bet you bottom dollar, I couldn't find the data on how many schools have been open that time, but living in Melbourne, probably 5, if you're lucky. We're not going to get there, guys. And that's why we've got students in demountable classrooms now, having to split lunchtimes because there's no room. And this is the big one. This is the one, let's face it, this is why you're here. Housing. So chart here, I've charted dwelling completions versus population growth. As Jane said, and as I said earlier, Australia's population shot up from 2005 when we ramped immigration, but supply didn't catch up. We had a brief period in the latter part of last decade where we built a whole bunch of defective, faulty, high-rise dog boxes in Sydney and Melbourne. And turns out, about 60% of them got faults. So you got Mascot Towers, Opal Towers, etc. So they weren't great quality, but hey, we did at least keep up with population growth for a bit. Obviously, with this huge migration surge, the supply shortage has just gotten off the charts. So we only added, so once you net out demolitions, we only added 166,000 homes to the nation's housing stock last year. That's against a population increase, the latest data, 660,000. So we only added 1 home for every 4 new arrivals. The problem is, it's not shown in this chart, but if I put on dwelling approvals and dwelling commencements, which are leading indicators, both of those are pointing to about 150,000 dwellings being built in the period ahead. So we're actually going to build less. And that figure is about 91,000 less than Albo's mythical 240,000 new homes target. We're not going to get anywhere near there at the same time as they're ramping immigration. And of course, this huge population spike has driven rental vacancy rates to a record low. You can't go anywhere in Australia without now seeing homelessness, without seeing people, being forced to live in group housing, hearing stories of people struggling to find rental accommodation, as well as being forced to pay nosebleed levels of rent. And it's also driving up your inflation because rent is one of the largest components of the consumer price index, which drives up inflation and then means you got higher interest rates as well. Now, you get some cats like Max Chandler Mather from the Greens, my good old mate Maxie. So Maxie has gone on twice on the public on Insiders and also on Q&A and said migration has no impact on the housing. It's not impacting rents. It's not impacting rents. You hear all the population apologists saying, no, it's not about migration. It's about other stuff. We just haven't built enough, etc. We've got some news for you, Max. Here's a chart of Australia's quarterly rental growth, asking rents. Now, this one comes from SQM Research. A guy called Justin Farbo at Antipodi and Macro created the chart. He makes great charts. I've used this one, but I could have used any of them, to be quite frank. And as you can see, rental growth fell at the start of the pandemic when immigration turned negative. When immigration got ramped up, it surged to record levels. Shock horror. More people, it means you need more rental accommodation. This chart here was created by Harry Otley at CBA about a week ago. It's a fantastic chart. And what it basically shows is it shows the growth in rents as measured in CPI, which again was negative when immigration turned negative. Surprise, surprise. Against the number of people, the proportion of population against apartment construction. So he's trying to make the point that if you want to look at supply and the impact on rents, it's actually more to do with the apartment market than the housing market, because most migrants go to apartments. But regardless, what it shows is that this collapse, this massive increase in immigration at the same time as we've had less housing supply, has just led to a massive spike in rents, and they're perfectly correlated there. The problem with it is, whilst we've increased population growth, our actual apartment approvals have collapsed. So high-rise apartment approvals are currently tracking at nearly 60% below their peak. That's the latest data. Low-rise apartment approvals are tracking 80% below their peak. At the same time as we're running huge population growth. So what do you think that means for rents? We're going to have less apartment supply at the same time as we're ramping immigration to record levels. It means this rental crisis is going to get a whole lot worse. And just to really hammer the nail into the spine of Max Chandler-Mather and co, CBA produced this chart showing the change in rents to the change in population. Population in red, rents in blue across the capital cities. I don't know about you, that's almost a perfect correlation there. So when they try and tell you immigration is not behind the rental crisis, well, but behind the current problem with rents, show them these charts. And also, how is it that the Reserve Bank of Australia has hiked the official cash rate by 4.25%, since May 2022, and magically house prices have gone up? Doesn't make any sense. And it was certainly something almost no economist predicted. The reason, of course, is immigration. So the RBA has hiked the cash rate, mortgage rates have gone up, people's borrowing capacity has actually fallen by about 30%. So if you're an average borrower now, you can borrow about 30% less than you could before they started hiking interest rates. Yet magically, prices have continued rising. It's pretty obvious why. This huge immigration with this limited housing supply, et cetera, has created fear of missing out. It's FOMO. People don't want to rent because rents are going through the roof. They're desperate to get out, so they're willing to do whatever they can to jump into the housing market, and that's bidding up house prices. So Max Chandler-Mather, I'm picking on him today. He's my target, but I could pick on anyone. Max's big solution is, no, it's not about immigration. We just need the government to build more public housing, right? That's his solution. Just we need to build more. Look, I'll give him some credit. He does have a bit of a point. This blue chart here is the amount of public housing we've built. We used to build, back in 1955, 22% of all dwellings were public housing. Now it's about 2%. The number is certainly too low. Anyone who's, can look at it objectively can say that. Right-hand side, private housing construction is in red, blue's public. Public has crashed. The problem with Max's proposal is that that's population growth against his public housing supply. The ratio of population increase to new public housing has soared from 14 in 1955. So basically we built one new public house per 14 new residents in 1955. Now it's 2020. That is not a year you're looking at. That is a number. We build one public house for 220 new residents in Australia currently. So Max can, yeah, sure, Max, mate, we can get that number up to here, maybe, boost it a bit, spend tens of billions of dollars extra building public housing. But do you really think it's going to make much difference when we're doing this? I don't think so. That is the solution. The number one solution. So we often hear though, say, oh, just build more. We just need to build more. It's a supply issue. Supply. The problem with that is, according to the OECD, Australia already has one of the highest shares of construction workers as a proportion of the economy. According to the OECD, now this population data here, they say we had about 26 million, I think. So it's a bit out of date, but I've just grabbed the latest OECD data and everything to make sure it's consistent. But based on the latest OECD data, 5.2% of Australia's population currently works in construction. Across the OECD average, it's 3.3%. We already have masses of people working on construction. It's still not enough though, because we've got too much population growth. 9.2% of Australia's workers currently work in construction. So that's as a share of the population, that's a share of the workforce, 9.2%. We've got record numbers. The other problem with just the just build more argument is that residential construction costs since the pandemic have surged by about 30 to 40%, depending on what measure you use. So it's becoming more expensive to build housing. The costs have increased, the cost of bricks, the cost of everything. At the same time, we have builders now competing for for workers against state government big build infrastructure projects. So they can't forget the workers. And let me tell you, if you're a tradie and you have the option of building a house and getting paid, and then being worried about getting paid because the buyer might default, etc., would you rather do that, or would you rather get paid 200 grand a year to work on one of Dan Andrews' big build infrastructure projects where you can, if it's raining, you don't turn up, and etc. Obviously, it's going to create shortages. And finally, we've got high interest rates. So at the moment, the interest rate, historically, they're not high, but they're high given the level of debt that Australia has. And these high interest rates, or, recently high compared to recent times, makes it less profitable to build. It reduces demand for new housing, which means you're not going to build it, but it also makes it more expensive for a builder if you've got to borrow to finance your construction. And just to really rub it in, here's a chart here in Australia, Australia's historical dwelling completions versus Albo's mythical, fanciful housing target. So Albo says we're going to build 1.2 million homes in 5 years, starting July 1 this year. That's his grand target. Good one, Albo. That's in red. The biggest year Australia ever did was about 221,000. I think it was in 2017, or maybe it's 2016. I could be wrong. There it is right there. We've never even been close. We're about 20,000 behind then at the peak of Australia's history. Currently, and based on the forward indicators, we're going to be 90,000 behind that. So we're never going to just build more to match this mammoth population growth. So what does it mean? It means the death of the Australian dream. I'd argue it's already pretty much dead, or it's dying. It's in the intensive care ward. It's on life support. So I've got this is census data now. It only goes to 2021. It's probably gotten worse given what's happened in the housing market the last couple of years. And the real key point here is the red chart and the blue chart. Mostly the red chart. So what this plots is home ownership rates by the younger cohorts. That's 25 to 40, 25 to 34 is red, and 25 to 44 green. For those cohorts in particular, the home ownership rate has collapsed. So it's gone from 61% in 1981 for 24 to 34-year-olds to 43% in 2021. A bigger issue, and this is going to be a huge issue for the retirement system going forward, is the share of homes owned outright has fallen from 41% in 2001 to 31% in 2021. It's based on the census data, but it's even worse for younger cohorts. So all that means is that people are now, even though you might be a homeowner, you've got a mortgage and you're carrying that mortgage for longer into your retirement. And then that creates problems. That will create problems for the retirement system because people are going to be withdrawing all their super, using it to pay off the mortgage, etc. And then be going back on the age pension, or they're going to simply just be paying debt into their old age. But arguably the bigger problem is we're basically changing the complete composition of Australia's cities. So I've got a chart here for Sydney. Sydney is the most extreme example, but it does illustrate the point. This is from the Urban Task Force. Their projections were, this is pre-COVID, based on census data and then going forward. But regardless, the Urban Task Force had 55% of Australia's homes in 2016 were detached dwellings. They forecast that by 2057, only 25%, so 1/4 of Sydney's homes will be detached houses. So basically houses with backyards. So that's less than half in a fairly short period of time. And by 2057, literally 50% of Sydney-siders, according to their forecasts, will be living in apartments. That there is the death of the Australian dream, right? Forget the quarter-acre block. You're going to have a situation where literally only a quarter of the people in Sydney live in a detached house. And I bet you can guess which quarter that's going to be. It's probably not going to be today's youth. It's going to be the rich. All right. So that is inequality. So what about skills shortages? Now Jane touched on this, but I'll want to go into a bit more detail from a different angle. So I describe Australia's migration system as a whack-a-mole migration system, right? This kid here could basically work in the immigration department. So the key justification for running high immigration, it's not the only one, is obviously population aging. Pick a myth. But one of them is obviously skills shortages, right? We need migrants to plug skills shortages. We don't have enough Australian workers, blah, blah, blah. We all heard it. And this myth pretty much was born, I'd argue, in 2001. So in 2001, or it was at least institutionalized in 2001. So in 2001, the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Australian Industry Group attended a parliamentary inquiry where they said, Australia is facing dire skills shortages and we need to import a whole bunch of workers. Otherwise, they're going to get worse and Australia is going to stagnate and we're not going to advance. Howard goes, yeah, okay, cool. Ramped up the immigration program from the, started in the early 2000s. It really got going by the mid 2000s, as those earlier charts showed. And then fast forward 24 years or 23 years, Australia's population's ballooned by 8.2 million people this century since the Sydney Olympics, pretty much. That's 44% growth. We've got more people doing university degrees than ever. And yet magically, we've got worse skills shortages than ever. Now, forget all the minutiae about this and that, whatever. If you're looking back and you're staring at it top down, you think, hang on, if we're growing the population by 44%, 8.2 million people, and the problem's gotten worse, maybe that's caused the problem and maybe we shouldn't keep doing the same thing over and over again. No. Can't do that. Danita Warren, this is just the latest example. She's the head of Master Builders Australia. Her big solution to the housing crisis. We've got to import 90,000 construction workers within the next 3 months to plug the housing shortage. Now, just think about that for a second. It's just logically. Those 90,000 builders are probably going to need about 90,000 homes, right, for them and their families, right? Okay, so that's out of the problem. They're probably going to demand some hospital care at some point. The kids are going to need school. They're going to need all the other government services and infrastructure that we use. So won't that create shortages in those areas? Hence the whack-a-mole, migration system. It's just basically special interest lobby. They get what they want. That creates problems there. Then they lobby and it just goes round and round. Now, I don't know who the guy on Twitter is. If you're watching this, please let me know because I want to give you credit because I use this flow diagram all the time. But some wise guy on Twitter did this great circular diagram, which basically highlights the entire immigration system as it pertains to houses. Houses are too expensive. Tell people we must increase housing supply, import more workers. Houses don't get built. Immigrants need somewhere to live. House prices go up. Houses are too expensive. That is Australia's migration system, pretty much in a nutshell. So, as Jane mentioned, and this is where we overlap, which is good because I'm glad I don't overlap too much. Otherwise, it'd be just repeating. But I'd argue, and so did Jane, that current immigration settings are driving skills shortages. Right. So we always have this mythical skills. Australia runs a skills-based migration program. It's complete garbage. We don't. If you actually look at the data, we do not. So this is from the migration review. And what it does, and what it did was it actually it did a survey of where international student graduates with bachelor degrees work 3 years or more after their degree. Is that 51% of them work in low-skilled jobs. We've got 26% level 5. That is the lowest skilled profession. Couriers, postal delivery workers, cleaners, etc. Level 4, bar attendants, baristas, waiters. These are people who've gone to university, right? They've gone to university, done a bachelor's degree. 3 years after, so they've had time to get a job in their field. They're working in low-skilled jobs, literally 51%. Arguably, one of the most ridiculous areas is engineering. I think Jane touched upon it as well. 60% of engineers in Australia are foreign-born, right? However, half of them do not actually work as engineers and they work in low-skilled jobs. Now, I didn't include in here because I ran out of space, but they had a great magazine cover from 2021 from Create. That's Engineer Australia's industry magazine. And it said, why can't migrant engineers get jobs? That was the thing. And they basically complained that they have half of engineers working jobs like Ubers. Yet we've got a shortage of engineers. We've always got a perpetual shortage of engineers. And the solution is always to import more engineers. How about we use the ones that are here? And you get that through a tight labour market, as Jane said. CEDA, this report came out last month. Recent skilled migrants earn more than 10% less than Australian workers and work in low productivity firms. They also have higher unemployment. That was CEDA's study. And they're actually a pro-immigration lobby. And even they admitted it was broken. On the right here, we've got the latest graduate outcomes survey. So this is the latest data of 2022. And what that measures is actually what the outcomes of graduates are, both domestic and international. And what it showed is that international graduate employment rates, participation rates, wages are all way below what domestic graduates earn. Now, What about productivity? You always heard we've got to have high immigration to increase Australia's productivity. Jane touched on it. We've got an immigration system that actually wrecks productivity. Now, this chart comes from Jared Minnack, who's an excellent independent economist. And he showed that basically we're having what economists call capital shallowing. So what that happens is when your business investment, your infrastructure, your housing does not keep up with population growth, you get lower productivity because you basically have less capital per worker. You have more congestion costs, all those sorts of things. That has been Australia's fate. We've grown the population faster than we've grown investment. And what that's done is it's killed productivity. But we've also got an immigration system that you might say but is directly contributing to the housing shortage, not just through the extra people, but also because we've got way too many student graduate types coming in and they don't work in construction trades, etc., which directly create shortages in construction trades. So this chart here comes from the Grattan Institute. And what it showed is that 32% of Australian workers are foreign born, but only 24% of workers work in building and construction. Sorry, only 24% of workers working in building and construction born overseas. So they're overly concentrated in university type roles, but then they can't get jobs in universities. They're not working, these low skilled jobs. So Australia needs a migration system that is way lower in size and better targeted towards the skills we need. We also need to calibrate migration to a level that is below the nation's capacity to build homes, to build infrastructure, and obviously in keeping with the natural environment, water supplies, etc. And I'll just add one last shot at Labor. Labor has this ridiculous policy. I'd argue there's too many people going to university right now. We've got 45% of young people go to university. I think it's weighted too far away from vocational. We need more trades and that sort of thing. There's a whole reasons for that, but Labor has set a target of 55% of young people going to university. So that's 10% more than currently. And all it's going to do is it's going to deprive people more of these vocational skills, build tradies, etc., and just create more shortages. So the question is, how do you actually lower immigration? Right. So under the intergenerational report, Australia's population is projected to grow to 40.5 million people. There's 13.5 million people by 2062, 63. Just to put that into perspective, that's like adding a current Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane in just 39 years. It's impossible. You cannot build enough infrastructure. You cannot maintain a high quality of life with those sorts of numbers. So obviously migration's got to be lowered to a level that focuses on quantity over quality. And I'd suggest that sort of level. That was sustainable. That was normal. This is not. So how do you do it? There's two. There's the big picture solution, and then there's the individual solutions. The big picture solution, I'd argue that one of the main reasons why we run this absurd high immigration policy is because the federal government collects 80% of the tax revenue. It's actually 82% to be precise. And what that does is it means that the federal government collects all the benefits from migration through higher company taxes and higher personal income taxes. It basically privatizes the gains from immigration. So if you bring in 100,000 migrants, chances are most of them are going to work, and then you get all the extra income tax revenue. The problem is most of the costs of immigration don't fall on them. They fall on the states. They fall on the local governments. They fall on you and me when the states privatise everything. And if you end up driving around Sydney now, you can't go anywhere with Transurban without Transurban taking money out of your pocket, right, on toll roads. The federal government doesn't factor that into their equation because it doesn't fall on their balance sheet, right? So they get all the benefits. They don't have to worry about the cost that falls on other jurisdictions or the private citizen. And as a result, they have an incentive to maintain a high immigration system. They also have an incentive because it means that Australia can avoid a recession, even though we're in a per capita recession, because stupid media doesn't really report per capita and everyone cares about the overall economic pie. So an obvious solution and would be to require somehow, I don't know how this would happen, but require the federal government to give the states a fixed allocation of at least $50,000. It should probably be closer to 100 using Jane's estimates for every resident that lands in a jurisdiction. So for example, if Melbourne gets an extra 100,000 people, it should get 50 billion, whatever it is, 100,000 times 50,000 extra revenue from the federal government. And what that would do is that would then force the Australian Treasury to balance the benefits of immigration against the costs. And I guarantee you, if they had to do that, they would cut the migration intake because it wouldn't see it as all gravy. Because at the moment, it is 100% gravy for the federal government and the Treasury. They love it. Gives them all this extra tax revenue. They don't bear the costs. If you make them bear the costs, they'll start thinking twice and they'll probably cut the intake. We should also give Australians a plebiscite on Australia's future population size. Like, it doesn't have to, just ask them the question, give them options. How big should Australia's population be? Let us pick, and then they can set policy around it. Some micro solutions. So obviously, you got the permanent migrant program, which has currently got caps on it. You got temporary, which is uncapped, which is crazy. The permanent migrant program, two easy things you can do. The family streams currently set at 52,500. Abolish parent visas. Currently, we give out 8,000 visas today to elderly people, elderly parents of migrants who can come here. And the Productivity Commission estimates they cost the taxpayer $300,000 per visa issued over their lifetime. That's 300 grand that you can't have for your hospitals that we've got to pay for. It's ridiculous. It ages the population directly. It costs a fortune. The Productivity Commission and others have said, scrap these. The skilled stream is currently at about 140,000. We should cut the intake significantly and raise the skilled migrant salary threshold. So Jane mentioned for temporaries, it's gone to 70,000, but we should bring in a threshold that is at least minimum above the median full-time pay, which is currently 90,000. I think it should be significantly above that, as long as alongside age limits. So basically, you want younger skilled migrants who also earn more. They'll pay more tax. They'll work in higher skilled professions, and you get more gravy that way, and obviously lower numbers. And obviously, the higher the wage threshold, the more productive the migrant, and the more income tax they'll pay. And obviously, you should run a much lower system with a much higher salary threshold. The temporary program, obviously cap it, and also aim for quality over quantity. So for skilled workers, again, raise that pay threshold above 90,000. You will slash the numbers massively if you do that. Currently, it's like 60% were earning below 70,000 or something. It was crazy. For student visas, concentrate on attracting a small pool of absolutely exceptional, genuine students. At the moment, we're not getting a huge share of our students aren't genuine. They're coming here for work and permanent residency. That should be pretty obvious. Raise financial barriers to entry. So raise how much money they must have in their bank account. Raise their application fees. Increase entrance requirements, particularly English language proficiency, their academic results, etc. Raise teaching standards. Actually test them properly, and if they don't pass, well then they get a chance, and if they don't pass again, they go home. Abolish group assignments. When I did my honours degree in commerce, we never did group assignments. It was up to you to do it as an individual, and you got graded on that. Nowadays, they pair you up with the international, and then you end up doing most of the work, and then you pass them. That's the way it is. And also sever the clear link between studying, working, and permanent residency. Why did Labor increase the amount of hours that a student can work while in study to 24 hours a week? It was 20 hours pre-pandemic. That's just a carrot for more students to come here. That should be cut back. They should be coming here to study, not to work. These sorts of reforms would improve student quality, increase export income. So you probably all heard that international students are our third biggest export. Completely bogus figure. The way they count that is they basically say that any expenditure by an international student while they're in Australia is counted as an export. Problem is, most of them work while they're here, so they earn money here. Yet that money they earn here is then counted as an export. It's farcical, right? So based on that, if I change my status to an international student, everything I earn, doing what I do at MacroBusiness, etc., would be counted as an export. It's not a real figure. It's fake. But regardless, if you did this, would have some genuine export income because the money would come from overseas. It would raise wages and working conditions because they wouldn't be working in these low-skilled jobs. And you'd also, reduce enrolment levels massively because, let's face it, they come here for work and permanent residency first and foremost, and you slash the numbers. If you cut back the migration chance and you cut back the ability to work, our international student numbers would collapse, but they'd be very high quality. And last but not least, we've got to require universities to provide on-campus accommodation in proportion to their student populations. So currently, 80% of students that study here, international students, go on the private rental market, right? So if you have an extra 100,000 students, chances are 80,000 are going to go to the private rental market. They create rental problems. How about we require the universities, if they want to grow their student base, they could build more student accommodation to accommodate them. That way it'd take pressure off the rental market. It would also cap numbers because they go, oh, no, too expensive, can't afford that. And then they'd be capped. And one final point before I finish, if you lower the permanent intake, you're automatically going to reduce the temporary migration intake because the carrot of permanent residency will disappear. So at the moment, we've got this uncapped system. A lot of them come here and they go, okay, there's a pretty good chance we'll get permanent residency if we, stick it out long enough because our permanent migrant intakes at 220,000-ish, 215,000. We cut that down to, cut it right back. They're not going to come here anymore as temporaries because they go, well, we're not going to be able to get permanent residency. So what's the point of going? So if you cut that, you cut that. And then you cut net overseas migration. Simple as that. Anyway, I'll take some questions.
Thanks, Leith and Jane. I'm sure you'll all agree that there's never been a better time to be an Australian landlord, and that we don't have a shortage of teachers or nurses or doctors. We've just got too many bloody students and sick people. And if only that were the case.